She was hired to translate words. But when the refugee mother started sobbing, the translator did something no one expected. She stopped translating and started telling their story. The story the family was too ashamed to share. The story that would make Steve Harvey walk off stage in tears. And the story that 47 million people would watch in complete silence.
It was Thursday, October 19th, 2023, at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The morning had started like any other taping day. Crew members moved with practiced efficiency, audience members filed into their seats buzzing with excitement, and Steve Harvey stood backstage reviewing his note cards, cracking jokes with the production staff. The energy was light, optimistic, ready for another episode of wholesome family entertainment. But standing in the green room, separated from the typical pre-show chaos, was a family unlike any that had ever competed on Family Feud, the Al-Rahman family from Nashville, Tennessee. Except they weren't originally from Tennessee. They weren't originally from anywhere in America. 3 years ago, they'd been living in Aleppo, Syria, in a neighborhood that no longer existed. Lila Al-Rahman, 38, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture rigid with a tension that hadn't left her body since 2019. Her husband, Omar, 42, stood near the door, unable to sit, unable to relax, his eyes constantly scanning the room in a habit born from survival. Their 3 children sat between them. Amira, 14, wore a hijab and kept her eyes down, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. Hassan, 11, sat completely still, unnaturally still for a boy his age, the kind of stillness that comes from learning that movement attracts attention, and attention can be dangerous. And little Zara, 7, the only one who smiled occasionally, though her smiles never quite reached her eyes. Next to them sat their translator, Miriam Cassis, 52, a Lebanese-American woman who'd been working with refugee families in Tennessee for nearly a decade. She'd translated at hospitals, schools, legal proceedings, and now, unexpectedly, a game show. Miriam had agreed to this appearance reluctantly. She'd argued with the family about whether this was appropriate, whether exposing themselves on national television was safe, whether they were ready. But Omar had insisted. "We need to show them we are normal," he'd said in Arabic. "We need to show America that we are families, just like them, that we laugh, that we play games, that we are human." Miriam hadn't told him that she could see the cracks in Lila's composure. She hadn't mentioned that Hassan flinched every time a door slammed during rehearsal. She hadn't said that she knew this family was performing normalcy, not living it. The casting team had been thrilled to book the Al-Rahman family. Diversity, representation, feel-good immigrant success story, it was perfect for the show's brand. They'd been told the family had resettled successfully, that Omar worked at a warehouse, that Lila was taking English classes, that the kids were in school. The American dream, condensed into a game show appearance. What they hadn't been told, what the family had carefully omitted from their application, was everything else. But Miriam knew everything else. She'd been there for every therapy session, every night terror, every breakdown. She knew what the cameras wouldn't see. And standing in that green room, she felt the weight of what she was about to participate in. "They will ask simple questions," Miriam said to Lila in Arabic, "about families, about happiness, about dreams. Nothing difficult." Lila nodded, but her hands trembled. "What if they ask about—" "They won't," Miriam interrupted gently. "This is entertainment. They want laughter, not tears." But Miriam was wrong. And what would happen in the next hour would prove that sometimes reality refuses to stay hidden, even under studio lights.
Steve Harvey walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, his burgundy suit sharp, his smile genuine, his energy infectious. He'd been hosting Family Feud since 2010, and he'd perfected the art of making every family feel special, every moment feel significant. All right, Steve called out, his voice booming through the studio. We've got something really special today, folks. We've got a family that's traveled further than any family in Family Feud history, not just to get to this studio, but to get to this country. The audience applauded as the Al-Rahman family walked onto the stage. Omar led them, shaking Steve's hand firmly, perhaps too firmly, trying to project strength. Lila followed, her smile fixed and fragile. The children arranged themselves carefully, Amira pulling Zara close. And Miriam stood to the side, microphone clipped to her collar, ready to translate every word that would pass between Steve Harvey and this family that carried more weight than any game show was designed to hold. "Now we've got Miriam here who's going to help us communicate," Steve said warmly, gesturing to her. "Miriam, thank you for being here. And Omar," Steve turned to the father, "welcome to Family Feud, sir." Miriam translated, and Omar responded in Arabic, his words formal, grateful. "He says it is an honor to be here, and his family thank you for this opportunity." Beamed Steve, "Well, we're honored to have you. Now, tell me about your family. How long have you been in America?" Omar answered, and Miriam translated smoothly. 3 years. We came from Syria. We were resettled in Nashville, and now we work hard to build our life here." The audience applauded supportively. Steve nodded with genuine respect. 3 years? That's amazing, man. And you've got these beautiful children. Tell me about them. This was supposed to be easy. This was supposed to be the heartwarming introduction that made everyone feel good about immigration, about resilience, about the American dream. But as Omar began to speak about his children, Miriam noticed Lila's breathing had changed. Short, shallow breaths, panic breathing. Miriam translated Omar's words. "This is Amira. She is in 9th grade and loves mathematics. Hassan plays soccer and wants to be an engineer. And Zara," Omar's voice caught slightly, "Zara is our light." "Your light," Steve repeated, kneeling down to Zara's level. "That's beautiful. Are you excited to be here, sweetheart?" Zara nodded but said nothing. Miriam didn't need to translate silence, but she saw the way Zara's hand gripped her mother's, the way Lila's jaw clenched. "All right," Steve stood back up, the energy shifting back to game show mode. "Let's play Family Feud."
The first 2 rounds went smoothly. Standard questions, simple answers, lots of laughter. Miriam translated efficiently, the family relaxed incrementally, and Steve worked his magic, making them feel like they belonged on that stage just as much as any American-born family ever had. "Name something you'd find at a birthday party," Steve read from the card. Omar buzzed in. "Cake." The answer was on the board. Number 2. The audience cheered. "Name a place families go on vacation." Amira, gaining confidence, buzzed in and answered through Miriam. "Beach." Number 3 answer. More applause. Hassan got his turn, answering a question about favorite foods. Lila participated, her answers careful but correct. The Al-Rahman family was winning. And for a moment, it almost seemed like Omar had been right. They were just a normal family playing a normal game. But then came the fast money round. Steve stood with Omar at the center podium, the rest of the family sent to the soundproof room. This was the moment that could win them $20,000, the moment that could change everything. "All right, Omar," Steve said, his tone shifting to that focused intensity that fast money requires. "I'm going to ask you 5 questions. You'll have 15 seconds. You ready?" Miriam translated. Omar nodded, his body tense with concentration. "Here we go," Steve said. "Name something every parent wants for their children." Omar answered immediately in Arabic. Miriam translated, "Safety." Steve's face flickered with something, recognition perhaps of the weight in that single word, but he moved on. "Good answer. Name a place where families feel happiest." "Home," Omar said through Miriam. "Name something you would risk everything to protect." "Family," Omar answered without hesitation. 3 questions in, and the audience was invested. These weren't just game show answers, these were truths. "Name something you pray for every night." Omar's voice cracked slightly. "Peace." Miriam's translation came out quieter than his answer. She felt it building, the pressure of what was being asked and what was being left unsaid. Steve paused, looking at Omar with an expression that had shifted from game show host to something more human, more present. "Last question," he said gently. "Name the hardest thing about being a parent." And that's when everything changed. Omar opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. His face crumpled, his shoulders shook, and then Lila, who'd been watching from the family section, let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a scream, but something in between. A sound of grief held too long, breaking free. Steve immediately moved toward them, instinct overriding format. Hey, it's okay." But Miriam stepped forward, and what came out of her mouth wasn't a translation of Omar's answer. "The hardest thing about being a parent," Miriam said, her voice breaking, "is having to choose which children live and which children die." The studio went silent. Not the anticipatory silence before a reveal, but the horrified silence of people realizing they've stumbled into something sacred and terrible. Steve Harvey froze. His microphone hand dropped slightly. "What?" Miriam looked at the family, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Lila, who was now sobbing openly, at Omar, who'd collapsed to his knees, at the 3 children who stood perfectly still, waiting for the secret to finally be spoken. "They didn't tell you," Miriam said, and she was speaking to Steve, to the audience, to America, no longer translating, but testifying. "They didn't tell you that they used to have 5 children, not 3, 5. The audience gasped collectively. Steve's face transformed from confusion to dawning horror. "They didn't tell you," Miriam continued, her voice gaining strength even as tears fell, "that in 2019, when the bombing started in their neighborhood in Aleppo, when their apartment building was hit, Omar and Lila had 15 seconds to make a decision. Their oldest daughter, Fatima, was 16. Their son, Kareem, was 9. They were on the 4th floor. The stairs were collapsing. The building was on fire. Lila was screaming now, a sound of pure anguish. Steve moved toward her, but he didn't know what to do, what to say. No one in that studio knew what to do. They could only carry 3 children, Miriam said. The building was coming down. There was smoke, fire, chaos, and they had to choose. Omar grabbed Hassan, Lila grabbed Zara, and Amira ran on her own. They made it out. Fatima and Kareem didn't. The studio erupted in cries of shock and grief. Audience members were openly weeping. Camera operators lowered their equipment, unable to watch through lenses anymore. Steve Harvey, the man who'd built a career on never being speechless, had no words. He stood there, his face contorted in pain, tears streaming down his cheeks. "They didn't die from the bombs," Miriam continued, and now she was speaking directly to the camera, her voice steady with the weight of bearing witness. "They died in the smoke. Omar heard them calling for him. He tried to go back, but other people held him. They held him while his children died, calling his name. That is what you don't see when you look at refugee families on your television. You see survivors. You don't see the ghosts they carry." Omar was on the floor now, his body racked with sobs that had been held back for 3 years. Layla had collapsed into Amira's arms, and Amira, 14-year-old Amira, who'd lost her siblings, who'd survived because she could run, stood there holding her mother, tears streaming silently down her face, but standing strong because someone had to stand. Little Hassan had wrapped himself around his father, and Zara, 7-year-old Zara, who'd been carried out of that building, who'd been chosen, stood alone, looking at all of them with eyes that had seen too much. Steve Harvey walked slowly to Omar. He knelt down beside him on the floor of the Family Feud stage. And then Steve Harvey, in front of millions of people, wrapped his arms around this refugee father and held him while he cried. The producers didn't cut to commercial. The director didn't call cut. Every person in that studio understood that what was happening transcended television, transcended entertainment, transcended everything they thought they knew about their jobs. After what felt like hours, but was only minutes, Steve pulled back, his face soaked with tears, and looked at Miriam. "Why didn't they tell us?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because they're ashamed," Miriam answered. "Because Omar thinks he made the wrong choice every single day. Because Layla wakes up screaming their names. Because Hassan hasn't spoken about his siblings in 3 years. Because Amira feels guilty for surviving when she was the fastest. Because Zara doesn't understand why her brother and sister aren't here, but everyone tells her to be grateful she is." Steve looked at the family, then at the audience, then at the cameras that were still rolling. "Turn them off," someone from production said quietly. "No," Steve said sharply. "Don't you dare turn them off." He stood up slowly, helping Omar to his feet. He gestured for the entire family to come to center stage. They moved like people in a dream, or a nightmare they'd been reliving for 3 years. When they were all together, Steve addressed the camera directly. "America," he said, his voice shaking but clear, "you just saw something real. Not entertainment, not a feel-good immigrant story, reality. This is what war does. This is what trauma looks like. This family didn't come here for opportunity. They came here because their home was turned into a graveyard, and they carry the weight of impossible choices that no parent should ever have to make." He turned to Omar and Layla, speaking to them even though he knew they couldn't understand without Miriam translating. But some things transcend language. "You made the only choice you could make," Steve said, his voice breaking. "You saved who you could save, and the children you lost, Fatima and Kareem, they would want you to honor their memory by living, by protecting the children who survived, by being here, by being brave enough to stand on this stage, even though every question we asked was a knife in your heart." Miriam translated, and Omar shook his head violently, words pouring out in Arabic. "He says he should have made 2 trips, Miriam translated, crying as she spoke. "He says he should have been faster, stronger, braver. He says he failed them." Steve grabbed Omar's shoulders, forcing eye contact. "You did not fail them. War failed them. The bombs failed them. The people who dropped those bombs failed them. But you," Steve's voice broke completely, "you are standing here, still being a father to 3 children who need you, still breathing, still fighting. That's not failure. That's survival. And survival when you've lost everything is the bravest thing a human being can do." The audience wasn't just crying anymore. They were standing, not to applaud, but because bearing witness to this pain while sitting felt wrong. Some people had their hands over their hearts. Others had their arms around strangers. The studio had transformed into something like a church, a sacred space where suffering was being acknowledged, where truth was being honored. Miriam stepped forward, looking at Steve. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was hired to translate their words, not tell their story. But I couldn't." Her voice broke. "I couldn't keep pretending that this was just a game. I couldn't translate what's the hardest thing about being a parent without telling you the answer that this family lives with every single day." Steve turned to her, his face full of an emotion that was too complex to name. "Don't apologize. What you did," he paused, struggling to find words, "what you did was the most honest, most courageous thing I've ever seen on this stage. You gave them permission to stop performing survival and start acknowledging grief." He looked back at the family. Little Zara had started crying now, not the silent tears of before, but loud, gasping sobs. Lila scooped her up, holding her tight, and for the first time since the secret had been revealed, Lila spoke. She spoke in broken English, her accent thick, her words halting but clear. "I love all my children, the 3 here, the 2 in heaven. I love them all the same. But I have to be mother to these 3 now. That is why we come here, to show them life can still have joy, even when heart is broken forever." Miriam didn't need to translate. Everyone understood. Steve Harvey, the comedian, the host, the professional who'd made millions of people laugh over decades of entertainment, stood on that stage and cried like a child. And then he did something unprecedented in television history. He canceled the game. "There is no winner here today," Steve said to the cameras. "There's no prize money because no amount of money makes sense in the context of what this family has lost and what they've shared. But," he turned to the producers, "we're giving them $100,000, not as prize money, as recognition, as respect, as America saying, 'We see you, we hear you, and we are so deeply sorry for what you've endured.'" The audience exploded in applause, but it wasn't celebratory, it was solidarity. Steve continued, "And we're setting up a fund in memory of Fatima and Kareem al-Rahman, for other refugee families, for therapy, for education, for helping children who've survived war process their trauma. Because," his voice broke again, "because those two children should be here. They should have grown up. They should have had futures. And since they can't, we're going to make sure other children like them get the support they need." Omar collapsed again, but this time it wasn't entirely grief, it was also release. The secret that had been crushing him, the shame that had been poisoning their family, had been spoken, and instead of judgment, they'd received something they hadn't experienced in 3 years: witness, recognition, validation that their pain was real and their impossible choice was understood. What happened next lasted over 2 hours. The producers extended the taping. They brought in counselors, they set up private rooms where the family could decompress, but first they did something else. Steve Harvey invited the audience to stay if they wanted to. No one left, and he facilitated what became the most important conversation of his career. How many of you have heard politicians talk about refugees like they're a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed? Steve asked the audience. Hands went up, reluctantly at first, then more confidently. How many of you, if you're being honest, have felt that way too? More hands. The room was being honest. "I get it," Steve said. "I understand that fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear that there isn't enough to go around. But," he gestured to the al-Rahman family, who sat together, exhausted but present, "this is what we're actually talking about when we talk about refugees. Not statistics, not political talking points. Human beings who've survived the unsurvivable, who carry trauma we can't imagine, who are trying desperately to rebuild lives in a country that often sees them as threats instead of neighbors." An older white man in the audience stood up, his voice shaking. "I voted against refugee resettlement in my town. After today," he couldn't finish the sentence. He just shook his head and sat back down, crying. A young woman raised her hand. "I'm a teacher. I have refugee students. I didn't understand why they act differently, why they're so quiet or sometimes so angry. Now I understand they're carrying things I'll never understand." One by one, people shared. Misconceptions they'd held, fears they'd nursed, prejudices they'd inherited. And one by one, they acknowledged that the al-Rahman family had shattered every assumption simply by being honest about their humanity. Miriam spoke again, her voice still raw but steady. "I translate for families like this every week. Every single one has a story like this. Maybe not exactly the same, but the same level of loss, trauma, impossible choices. And every single one tries to hide it because they think if Americans knew what they'd been through, they'd be rejected. They perform normalcy because they're terrified that showing their pain will make them unwelcome." "But that's backward," Steve said, his voice filled with passion. "Their pain is exactly why they need welcome. Their trauma is exactly why they need community. We don't heal by hiding our wounds. We heal by having someone witness them and say, 'I see you, and you're still worthy of love.'" He turned to the al-Rahman family. Through Miriam, he asked them, "What do you want America to know?" Omar spoke for a long time. Miriam translated, crying throughout. "We are not asking for pity. We are asking for understanding. When you see us in your grocery stores, in your schools, at your mosques or churches, we are not threats. We are parents trying to keep our children safe. We are people who have lost everything and are trying to build something from nothing. We make mistakes because we are learning a new language, a new culture, a new way of being. But we are trying so hard. Every single day we wake up and try to be worthy of the second chance we have been given. Not just for ourselves, but for the children we lost. We survive for them. Layla added in her broken English, "Please, when you see refugee family, remember, we are not choosing to be here because we want adventure. We are here because home became impossible, and we bring with us ghosts, so many ghosts, but also hope. Hope that maybe our children who survive can have future that our children who died never got." The audience was devastated, transformed. Every person in that room knew they would never think about refugees, about immigrants, about the other the same way again.
The episode never aired as a traditional Family Feud episode. Instead, the network created a 90-minute documentary special called The Unspoken Truth, when a game show became a witness stand. It aired 6 weeks later in primetime and became the most-watched documentary of 2023, drawing 67 million viewers. The special included the full raw footage from the studio, interviews with trauma experts explaining PTSD in refugee populations, context about the Syrian war, and follow-up interviews with the Al-Rahman family conducted weeks after the taping. In those follow-up interviews, something remarkable had happened. Omar looked lighter, not happy. Grief of that magnitude never fully lifts, but lighter. "For 3 years, I wake up and first thing I think is, I killed my children by not saving them," he said through Miriam. "Now, I still think of them first thing every morning, but I also think that maybe I honored them by saving the ones I could save. That is not healing, but it is different. It is something." Layla had started speaking at refugee resource centers, telling her story to help other families understand that trauma is not weakness, that surviving impossible situations requires impossible choices, and those choices don't make you a monster. Amira had joined a support group for refugee youth. She'd started writing poetry about her siblings, about survivor's guilt, about learning to live when part of your family is gone. Her teacher submitted one of her poems to a national competition. It won. Hassan had finally spoken about Kareem. He told his therapist that he remembered Kareem teaching him to tie his shoes. That memory, spoken aloud for the first time in years, made him cry for hours. But afterward, he smiled. Remembering, he realized, was a way of keeping his brother alive. And Zara, who'd been so young when it happened, had started asking questions. Real questions. Why did you take me and not them? Questions that had no good answers, but that deserved honesty. Her parents gave her honesty. They told her it was random. It was terrible. It was not because she was more loved, but because she was physically closer when time ran out. She was 7 years old, processing survivor's guilt, but she was doing it with parents who'd stopped pretending the loss hadn't happened. The documentary followed up with the studio audience members, too. The older white man who'd voted against refugee resettlement had volunteered to tutor refugee children in his town. The young teacher had completely restructured her classroom approach to be trauma-informed. Dozens of audience members had donated to the Fatima and Kareem Al-Rahman Memorial Fund, which raised over $4 million in its first month. Steve Harvey himself was transformed. He gave an interview to Oprah 3 months later, and when she asked him to describe the moment Miriam stopped translating and started testifying, he said, "I thought I understood suffering. I grew up poor. I struggled. I faced racism. I've had my share of pain. But what that family survived, what they continue to survive, made me realize that the American dream means something different when you first had to survive the American nightmare. When your dream isn't success or fame or money, but simply being allowed to exist without bombs falling on your children." He paused, composing himself. "I can't host a game show the same way anymore. I can't pretend that every family walking on that stage is just there for fun and prizes, because some of them are there to prove they deserve to be alive. And that's too heavy a burden for any human being to carry.
So now I try to make space for their full humanity, the joy and the pain, the survival and the loss, all of it. The backlash came, predictably. Right-wing media accused Steve of politicizing entertainment. They claimed the Al-Rahman family was performing, that their story was exaggerated, that Steve was pushing an agenda.
But then Paul Thompson, a former U.S. Marine who'd served in Syria, posted a video that went viral. He'd been in Aleppo in 2019. He'd seen the aftermath of the bombing that killed Fatima and Kareem. He'd helped pull bodies from rubble. He verified in graphic detail that what the Al-Rahman family described wasn't exaggeration. It was, if anything, an understatement. "I've voted Republican my whole life," Thompson said in his video, tears streaming down his face. "I've said things about refugees that I'm ashamed of now. But I was there. I saw what we left them to face. And every family that makes it here alive is a miracle. Full stop. They're not Democrats or Republicans. They're survivors, and we owe them basic human decency." His video was viewed over 120 million times. The impact rippled outward in ways no one had predicted. Congressional representatives used the documentary in hearings about refugee resettlement. Schools across America added it to their curriculum. Churches held special screenings, followed by discussions about compassion and welcome. But perhaps most significantly, it changed individual lives. Miriam, the translator, received thousands of messages from other translators, social workers, and professionals who worked with refugee populations. They'd all felt that same weight of carrying other people's unspeakable stories. The documentary gave them permission to speak those stories, to be witnesses instead of just conduits. One message came from a woman named Sarah Chen, a resettlement caseworker in Minnesota. She wrote, "I've been doing this work for 8 years. I've heard hundreds of stories like the Al-Rahmans, but I've never been allowed to share them because of privacy rules. Watching you choose to speak their truth when they couldn't, it reminded me why I do this work. These stories matter. These people matter. And silence protects no one except those who want to ignore the cost of war." 2 years after the episode was filmed, Steve Harvey hosted a special reunion that brought together the Al-Rahman family, Miriam, and dozens of other refugee families who'd been inspired to share their own stories. Omar stood on that stage, his English significantly better now, and said something that the audience would remember forever. "When we first came to America, I think we must pretend to be okay so Americans will accept us. We must hide our broken parts. We must smile even when inside we are screaming. But what I learned from that day on at Family Feud is this: Americans do not need us to be perfect. They need us to be real. Because when we show our humanity, all of it, the broken parts too, then they can see we are the same. Parents who love children, people who survive, humans who deserve dignity." He paused, looking at Miriam. "And Miriam, you gave us permission to be real. You broke the rule. You stopped translating what we said and started translating what we meant. Thank you for choosing truth over politeness." Steve wrapped his arm around Omar's shoulders. "That's the lesson, isn't it? We've built a whole culture around politeness, around not making people uncomfortable, around avoiding difficult truths. But politeness doesn't heal wounds. Truth does. Witness does. Acknowledgement does." Layla, whose English had also improved dramatically, added, "I want to say to other refugee mothers who maybe watch this, it is okay to not be okay. It is okay to cry. It is okay to remember the children you lost while loving the children you saved. You do not have to choose between grief and gratitude. You can hold both. I hold both every single day." The reunion special ended with the announcement that the Fatima and Kareem Al-Rahman Memorial Fund had partnered with mental health organizations to create trauma-informed care centers in 10 cities with large refugee populations. The centers would provide free therapy, support groups, and resources specifically designed for families processing war-related trauma. Fatima would be 18 now, Omar said during the final moments of the special. Kareem would be 11.
I think about who they would have become every single day. But I also think their death will not be meaningless. Because of them, other children will get help. Other families will find healing. That does not make losing them okay. Nothing makes that okay. But it gives their memory purpose. And purpose, I am learning, is how we survive the unsurvivable. The camera pulled back to show the entire group, the Al-Rahman family, Miriam, Steve, and the dozens of other refugee families who'd come forward, standing together. Not performing survival, not pretending to be okay, just standing, witnessing each other, being fully human in all their complexity and pain and resilience. Steve Harvey's final words to the camera were simple. This is what it means to be human. Not the joy without the sorrow, not the success without the struggle, but all of it together. The refugees in your communities are carrying stories like this, every single one of them. You can choose to see them as burdens, as threats, as problems to be solved, or you can choose to see them as what they are, human beings who've survived hell and are asking for nothing more than the chance to rebuild. Choose wisely. Choose with love. Choose as if your own children's lives depended on the kindness of strangers. Because for the Al-Rahmans and for millions like them, that's not a hypothetical, that's reality. If this story broke your heart and opened your mind, subscribe to this channel and share it with everyone who needs to understand that behind every refugee family is a story of impossible choices and unimaginable loss. Hit that like button if you believe that compassion should always triumph over fear. Drop a comment below. Have you ever met a refugee family? Have you ever heard a story that changed the way you see the world? Have you ever had to make an impossible choice? Share your experience. Let's create a space where witness matters and truth heals. Because as Miriam, the translator, proved that day, sometimes the most important thing we can do is stop translating what people want to hear and start testifying to what people need to know, even when it breaks every rule, even when it costs us something, especially then. That's not just a television moment, that's a moral imperative.